Welcome, everyone. Let me see, I don't know if I need the mic really or not, but it's probably not, right? Welcome, everybody. It's great to see all of you, and in particular to be here together with you in this room where we don't spend nearly enough time with people that we like and respect. We don't spend time with people we don't like or respect either, but we don't spend enough time in general in this room like we used to. But this is one of my favorite evenings of the year always, to have our reflections from the field event. I think most of you know that the event tonight is actually returning to what the format of it was until the past few years, which is we'll have two panels this evening. The first panel is a panel of students from our master's program here at CGA, who have returned recently from graduate student consultancies abroad as part of the workshop in Applied Peacebuilding. And then after that panel, we're going to have a panel of peacebuilding practitioners who will be also looking at discussing a similar theme tonight to what the student panel will be. And that theme really is the tension, I would say maybe the growing tension between global peacebuilding and domestic peacebuilding here in the US, how we think about it, how it's carried out, how organizations are struggling with that tension. And so both panels will be looking at those themes. I think everybody, what I'm about to say is probably a little bit unnecessary because almost everybody in the room has a connection to the workshop in Applied Peacebuilding, but for the few of you who do not, let me explain to you what this is. The workshop is a course that's been taught here now at the Center for Global Affairs for 12 years. And each spring, I would say a particularly intrepid group of our students decides to take on the challenge of working with usually an international peacebuilding partner organization, developing a project, developing a relationship with the partner organization during the spring semester, and then going into the field and carrying out a project or a component of a project during the summer. And so we're lucky to have quite a few people in the room here who were part of that class in the spring, and we'll be speaking about it on a panel in just a moment. We're going to have 4 of them. They've self-selected their own panel and moderator, and it's really, the workshop, I think, is a really special experience for students here in the program. And I think as evidence of that, we've got a couple of people in the room here who did the workshop. And what year did you do it? 2014? Earlier, maybe? Yeah. He doesn't want to cop to how old he is, but but there's some people here. And Colleen, you did it. What am I saying? Sarah, you did it in.
I'm just trying to do it
2019, yeah. So we've got, more recently. Yeah.
more recently.
But see, they come back. They don't always just disappear and go away. But it's, I wanted to show you a little something. The last night of the workshop, we have traditionally had a gathering. Now it's been established that we do it every year in Brooklyn on the Brooklyn Bridge Park. And historically, everybody's a little bit nervous because they're about to go to the field and they don't know exactly what's awaiting them. So I always take the opportunity to ask students to do some reflections. Our class is very much about becoming a reflective peacebuilding practitioner. And so I asked them to record some of their thoughts about about what they're about to do. So what I want to do here is I'm going to show you a couple of very brief film clips just to set the mood for you, to get an idea of sort of where the students were, at least sort of mentally, before heading out into the field for the summer. So this is one of 3 brief clips that I'm going to show you. This is Lerman Montoya, and I think we're set up.
Not going into this summer knowing I know what I feel like I need to know. And at the same time, I'm worried or concerned that I may not find those answers when I'm working over the summer. And I have to come to peace with the idea that I'm not going to know everything about the context or the details of the experiences, because that's not my own. So there's always going to be this level of direction of inaccessibility But just with the context of not being able to put in terms of, I think that is like one of the concerns. Also, another.
That's one. Eva Strasser.
My greatest concerns are that I'm a resident and a little visa and and we want to and I don't want to ask much less. We got a grocery shop. Okay, that was hard. So I really still don't know. My greatest concern is that I'm not sure what's going to happen this summer, but I think that that's okay. I think not knowing what's going to happen this summer. That's part of this building, is you're never gonna really know what's gonna happen. You just have to like go out there and be confident that you have this. I think what this class is really talking is that I have people around me who are gonna support me while I do that. Like there are people in this class who are gonna be able to take time to live, or gonna need to kind of live. They're gonna be people that I love. So really like growing and learning from one another and being willing to provide that same like support foundational base for that. I think that's important.
Finally, Losa, here in the room with us.
Or just stay longer. So yeah, I think just my whole worldview was shifted by this class and this experience. I'm looking forward to it getting shifted even more. And I brought this up in class maybe a few times. Just now learning how to be more comfortable with this comfort. And I'm excited. I'm excited to be uncomfortable in so many places, so many events, instances. This is a good start, I think, for anyone who's planning to get into building or just work in the space. So yeah.
Okay, so I think you get the idea. They were nervous, they were talking a lot, you can hear them chattering in the background, the ones who weren't on camera at the moment. And I also want to say, it's great to see all of you here. I'm realizing we have quite a few people online as well watching us, so welcome to everybody who's watching us on Zoom. We're going to move on to the first panel here, and I'll ask Ali Foote, who's going to be the moderator of that panel, to call her panelists up, and we'll get going. So, Ali, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I think most of you know me. My name's Ali. I'm a second-year student here at the Center for Global Affairs studying peace building. This summer I did participate in the workshop, so I was in Uganda with Anjali, who will be one of our panelists, as well as Yanela for a couple of days. And yeah, I'm really excited to kind of talk about tonight's theme, this tension between domestic and international peace building, specifically sort of focusing on our, I guess, experience as outsiders this summer. So I'd like to bring up Anjali Tallapragada, Stevie Robinson, and Pia Madanes to the stage. Okay, so I know most of us know each other, but I wanted panelists to first introduce themselves, sharing their name, the organization they worked with this summer, where they were, and a little bit about the project that they did, so we can kind of all orient ourselves in the discussion. You want to start with Anjali?
Hello, everybody. My name is Anjali. I was part of the program for last semester. I went to Uganda with Ali and Ian over there, and Ava, who's not here today. And we each had different projects, but me and Ali went towards the same time period, and we were working on. We created a training manual for mental health professionals supporting survivors of sexual gender-based violence from an African perspective. It's a lengthy training manual, and we used interviews and research from the organization that we worked with, some of their counselors and other members as well from the community to write the manual. That was a lot, but I can answer more questions about that throughout the discussion. I also went to Colombia, which might come up during this interview, but I also went to Colombia with Katerina over there as a part of the joint/advanced seminar in peace building as well, which is another class, which was fully in Spanish. So, and Ali was also a part of that, so that also might come up part of this interview.
I'm Stevie Robinson. This is my third semester at the CGA. I did my consultancy over the summer with Search for Common Ground in Sri Lanka. I was essentially predominantly working on advancing their advocacy and communication goals by linking national efforts to a wider international audience. And to be a bit more specific about that, I essentially distilled a few larger, lengthy program reports into shorter, more effective tools that they could then use to send to funders or other Search for Common Ground field offices and just the larger peace building community. And I believe those reports will also be translated into the two local languages that are most commonly spoken in Sri Lanka, Sinhalese and Tamil, so that the local population is also able to inform themselves on the peace building work that's going on in their own communities.
Hi everyone, my name is Pia. This summer I went to Jordan. I was working with an organization called Eyako Heh, which is, I think, a very interesting organization because they have 3 offices which work at the same level in Amman, Ramallah, and Tel Aviv. So I was in the Amman office working with the education team. My tasks were, I think, less defined. They were a bit more mixed, and the way my supervisor described it, which I really loved, and I'm now telling you, is basically providing a peace building perspective of their projects. So even though I do think they have a strong peace building perspective, I think she wanted kind of a international or outsider outlook on a lot of issues. So yeah, they're providing feedback on lesson plans, on educational modules, etc. And then part of my, I think my main work was supporting them in 2 of their conferences. They do conferences with teachers and youth. So I traveled with them to the north of the country and then to the south of the country for those conferences. And after that, I created some education materials, some teacher activities, and just a lot of materials for the teachers, basically.
Great, thank you, everybody. So obviously this summer, we all decided to partner and work with international organizations, as I think most of the people in our class did. But the list of partner organizations also did include some domestic organizations. So I think this was something that everybody grappled with a little bit, and I wanted to hear from our panelists why they chose to work with an international organization and what considerations did you make in making the decision, knowing that you were going to be an outsider in the context you were going into. Stevie?
Yeah, so, well, I'm not in classes here. I currently work as a grant writer and on the strategic innovation team of a domestic nonprofit that's focused on shrinking the digital divide. And one of the core purposes that I'm pursuing this master's degree is to explore other potential career pathways. And I'm fortunate enough to have bosses who are nothing but completely supportive and encouraging of that, and I'm so grateful to them for that. They're gracious enough to grant me a leave of absence over the summer so that I could go on this experience and have a chance to do some peace building work in a local or in an international context. I think both are important in their own right. Obviously, no one would argue against that. And I mean, I think approaching a peace building issue, it's just going to be multifaceted no matter what it is, and it's going to require a diverse group of backgrounds and areas of expertise, whether it's domestic or international. And I'm glad that I was able to enter an international context and fill a gap in their organization without infringing on the local expertise and knowledge. When I landed in Sri Lanka, I don't think anyone was under the impression that I was going to be able to know better than the local staff at Search for Common Ground what that community needed. but I was able to use my Western perspective and Western education to amplify local voices, local needs, and just the transformative work that they're doing at that organization. So I think in my mind, it doesn't matter as much whether you're doing domestic or international peace building. It's more about understanding your role and what capacity you're able to assist a peace building initiative that doesn't step on the toes of local knowledge.
Thank you. Pia, do you have anything to add to Stevie's response about this decision and the role that you played at your organization?
Sure, I love that response. I agree with that. I think for me, well, I'm not American, firstly, so I don't think this is my domestic setting at all. I'm from Argentina. I did think about doing some work domestically because I did really like one of the organizations, but my thought process was more like, okay, I have the chance to do this in the next few years. When will I have the chance to go elsewhere? Like, what, the time is now to try it. The time is now. I was always curious about like if that was something I would be interested going abroad to do work. So I decided to try it, which was good. I would encourage anybody who has that itch to use, the moment and try it now. I think for me, my main concern was always the language issue. I think that was just essential. I don't speak Arabic. I tried a little bit, but not great at it. That was my main concern. And also, like, I was very, I think going in, I was concerned about how it would be perceived. People often think I'm American or lately Scottish for some reason. And I don't like that. And I was worried about that because I was worried about that. And I think being Latin American allowed me to be in an interesting place where I was like an outsider, but not so much of an outsider. I feel like they knew I would understand corruption, for instance. They knew I would understand, just things not working, ways to get around things. It's just more, I feel like the stereotypes that they might have had about me worked in my favor in some way. Like, I was able to bring that Western perspective, but also connect on a different level, which was nice. And I definitely agree with Stevie and what she was saying, that I think it's important I think it kind of narrowed a little bit my view on where I can be useful abroad. I think it was, there's some things, I think providing an international outlook on things was very valuable to my boss and it was very interesting to me. But I feel now that it's much more specific and much more purposeful when you need to go abroad, when you need to go find someone from abroad and not from your local context.
Do you have anything to add?
I also agree with both of them as well, of course. Maybe a little bit similar to Pia because obviously, I'm not obviously to some, but I am Indian, and there's actually in Uganda, to my ignorance, which I did not know before going, there's a huge population of Indians living in Uganda, which I figured out my first day, and I was shocked that I was like, okay, I was so prepared to be an outsider, and when I got there, not that I didn't immediately, obviously people knew I was American, but I somewhat kind of fit in because they were not as shocked to see me. And I also went with Ali too, so I don't know if you had a different experience than me. But as that being said, I think, it just as an outsider, we learned in class that, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, it was very different because they looked at us as NYU students coming in, but I don't feel equipped to have all the answers to help the organization grow or to write this manual itself or what we did. And so we would always be like, they actually had all the answers, and we would come in and help them realize that they had the answers and they actually knew what they were doing. And sometimes we had to ask a lot of guiding questions to people, kind of, I wouldn't say to boost confidence within themselves, but to show that they had the answers all along, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Great. Well, it sounds like you all kind of were able to reconcile your position as outsiders and use some of the skills that we built in our peace building classes this summer, which is great. last spring, we also did do a lot of preparation of trying to prepare ourselves, not only to be outsiders, but also to understand the context that we were going into, both the culture context, historical, and of the organization and its work. But this was obviously challenging because we were not there, and also because some of us didn't have necessarily the best communication with our organizations. And so I think we had to prepare for a lot of the unexpected, but some of us had experiences that I think were unexpected on all levels. Stevie was actually in Sri Lanka during some of the protests this summer that were stemming from the recent political and economic crisis. So I was hoping you could kind of tell us a bit about that experience, what it felt like to be an outsider in that situation, and how you think you might have experienced the protests differently than the local Sri Lankan population.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time to be in Sri Lanka, to say the least. When I first got there, well, okay, before I got there, I was obsessively reading the news, reading as many articles about the situation in Sri Lanka as I could find. But even then, just no matter how much news I ingested, I knew that the situation is constantly changing, and I could read an article today and get there tomorrow, and it's a totally different situation. And beyond that, a lot of the news is very sensationalized. So I would read a BBC article about throngs of protesters and clashes with police and things like that. And then I would speak to supervisors or contacts that I had in Sri Lanka, and they would have a totally different perspective. And for them, life was still going on very much as usual at that time. So there was just no real way for me to prepare myself. I had no idea what I was walking into. And I got there, and it very much was normal when I first got there. I was still able to leave my apartment and hail a tuk-tuk right on the side of the road and get anywhere in the city for a reasonable cost. As time went on, tuk-tuks became harder to come by, fuel queues were really long. I think the average wait time for fuel that I heard was like spending 2 nights in their car in line to gas up, and even then there were rationing orders in place that was only for a few liters. And by the time I was ready to leave, the government had stopped selling fuel to private individuals, period, because they only had enough money to buy fuel for emergency vehicles and some public transport. So at that point, you know, mobility was very, very limited. It was really hard to get around. And if you could manage to find a tuk-tuk, the prices were exorbitant because they had purchased their fuel on the black market, and, you know, they paid five times the cost. All that's to say, it was definitely a moral quandary to be there for me, because on one hand, there was a lot of guilt being an outsider in a system that was under a lot of stress. I felt like I was taking resources that were very badly needed by the local population, and there was just a lot of guilt associated with that. At the same time, I knew that I was doing my best to make decisions that benefited the local economy most and mitigated negative effects of my presence as much as possible. And I will say the overwhelming attitude that I received from Sri Lankans was that they want a change in their international reputation as of late, that it's a country that you shouldn't go to, which was sad to hear. So being an outsider was definitely tricky, and I wish that I could have stayed the full 3 months that I intended to, because I initially was supposed to be there for 3 months, and that eventually got cut down to 1 month just because of everything going on. So I really wish that I was able to stay for the full 3 months, but at the same time, I'm very grateful that I was able to continue working with Search for Common Ground in a remote capacity so that I could continue to contribute positively to the peace building efforts in the country without taking any resources that I didn't need to be.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that sounds like a great experience that you sort of arrived at. You made peace with that, it seems.
Yeah, I think going into a situation like that, there's always going to be, you know, a level of uncertainty and guilt. And it's just kind of reconciling with that and finding the way to mitigate the negative parts and maximize the good parts.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw a question at Anjali now. that's not on the list, but I think something that I think Anjali and I basically spent the entire summer together. And something that we spoke about a lot was these feelings of guilt that were coming up in all these different international contexts, being outsiders from the US and from an expensive elite private university. And so I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on how you kind of work through those, reconcile it, what you kind of see the role or the presence of guilt in this field.
That's a loaded question, but yeah, something I realized this summer that actually made me really sad, and this is also my last semester, so a lot of thesis ideas came up to me during this entire experience, but I went with one group to Colombia, and then it was me and Ali in Uganda, but as I was talking to people, I was realizing a lot of us were going through guilt regardless of whether it was we were coming from a NYU or because of their gender or because of their family background, but I think it's something, at first, I just wanted to make everyone's guilt go away, including my own, for feeling like this, because obviously it feels awful, but also there's nothing you can do about it. But then with the reflective practices Tom's always telling us to write down in our journal, I realized that this guilt could be used into something, it could challenge you into figuring out why do we feel this guilt, where does it come from, what can we do with this guilt? So it could be turned into something that's productive, because I can't speak for everyone in this field, but I feel most people in this field feel guilt at some point, regardless of their entire background. So I think it's something worth looking into, really. But.
And kind of going off of that, this question's open to anybody, but do you think maybe if you're working in domestic peace building, these feelings of guilt might not be present, or do you think they just kind of show up in a different way?
I don't know, I don't think you can ever, I think something for me was, I always knew it, but I realized it more this summer, is there's never a domestic setting for anyone. I think here at NYU at least, or not everyone, but most of us have traveled, we have moved, like we have had all of these experiences, and that makes it hard for you to truly from somewhere and to truly know any community because of all these things we've been exposed to. So even for me, I think I kind of shifted to wanting to go back to Argentina, specifically also Latin America, but like I don't think I'll ever yet like I could ever really be an insider again, having had all these experiences. I think it's always you're like almost there. But I don't know, I think all these experiences, if your intention is to help those most in need, it's going to create some guilt and like some sort of like outsider side to it.
Yeah, I would say it's hard. You could go back to your hometown and be working with your own community. And I think after going through a program like this, there's always going to be a level of outsider identity to your work, just because by being at such a high ranking university and getting an education, we're shifting the power dynamic. And you're going back to help, but at the same time, you're coming back in a different role. And even if it's not your own community, I mean, there's just always, if you're working with low income people, you're never, there's always a level of outsiderness, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said here. So thank you for sharing, especially that curveball at all of you. But back to the scheduled programming, I had a specific question for Anjali, who, as we know, worked in 2 different countries this summer. And obviously something as an outsider that has been constantly coming up is adjusting to cultural differences, both within the larger population and your day-to-day life, but also in the workplace. So I was hoping Anjali could tell us about some of the most challenging cultural differences you encountered in the workplace and how you navigated being respectful and understanding of these differences while also trying to collaborate and push your project forward.
Yeah, this was quite the summer for me. Obviously, I think even tying back to your other question, like identity, is a huge thing in peace building. And you think you know what you identify as, and then through the experience, you realize there's more to your identity, things you didn't even know about. I mean, obviously I'm Indian and I'm a woman, but the list just kept on going and going this whole summer, things I was finding out about myself. But I think, so culturally, I grew up from an Indian background, maybe not as similar to other South Asian communities, but I just kept remembering all these childhood experiences when I was in Colombia and in Uganda, and comparing it to, my childhood experiences to what I was seeing, or how we were living in these other countries, because there were a lot of similarities, but there were also a lot of differences as well. I mean, I was born here in the US, so obviously as a first generation person, my experience is very different from someone who maybe lived internationally or was born internationally, but this sounds kind of funny, but like in Uganda, the power never worked. And it was a guessing game to see it was because someone didn't pay the bill, or like the power was just not going to be there, or when Ianella came her first week, the water shut down for a week, which was a nice welcome for her. But we would just collect buckets of water. But I mean, for me, that's how I grew up. Like we would go to India every 4 years, and I used to talk about it with Ali. Like was my life for the entire summer. And when I was a kid, I would cry and like a spoiled child, and I would tell my mom, "Well, I want to go to India," but I thank her because she kind of trained me to for all these experiences. But then on the other hand, I think something that was really difficult as an outsider and the cultural differences was creating boundaries but respecting cultural practices. For example, in Colombia, they have a different working style. I mean, in New York, we're like chop, 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 9 to 5. We're just so fast paced. And in Colombia, they have a lot of group meetings and they take their time with things. And it was actually really beautiful to watch, but also very frustrating for us in the beginning because we were like, come on, let's just get through this. I mean, from my experience. And then it took some time to do. And then I wish there was a way, something I wish I practiced or talked about, maybe with somebody, is how to create these boundaries where you're sharing what you would like in your thoughts without feeling guilt or understanding, saying like, I understand this is your culture, this is my culture, and then just sharing, because I feel like sometimes the guilt overtook, like, this is locally led, go ahead. You take care of everything, but I feel like as an individual, you should have, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but you should be able to set boundaries for yourself while also respecting their culture. So.
Pia, do you have anything to add about the cultural differences you encountered and how you kind of worked through those?
I would say I agree with that question, and it's something I've been asking myself. To some of us who are that, I mean, in the MN class, I think there was a question that was asked by one of our colleagues, Maria, that I think sums it up. It's kind of that thing about how do you respect local culture, but at the same time, you have your own ideas and your own values and your own things you care about. Like that bridge between advocacy and peace building, I think, was something that I really encountered this summer. I had a lot of thoughts about that, and it's a never-ending motion. That's what I would say. I've been also thinking about that. We can talk.
Great. So Pia, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your experience at EcoPeace. It sounds like you had a very consultative sort of experience as a graduate student consultant, providing a peace building perspective on the peace lesson plans and workshops. And it sounds from your introduction like they were really receptive to your perspectives on peace building, but did you encounter any sort of tension between the way that you conceptualize peace building and the way the organization does? And were you able to bridge those gaps, or did it kind of result in some, tension between you and your supervisors?
I think it depends on who. I think it's a very, I love my experience there because it's such a complex organization. I think I meant to mention this, I don't know if I did, but they work in Israel and Palestine, Jordan at the same time, staff are at the same level. It's very
collaborative, but at the same time, people are very different and they have different backgrounds, so they have different lived experiences. So it's very hard for all of that to work very cohesively. And I think something that came up a lot was basically the work that they do. I think is very interesting because basically they take, basically like water, what everybody needs. You can't divide the ocean, you can't divide rivers, you can't divide them. It's impossible. And they try to promote collaboration using water. So I think that's how I conceptualized it. It's like using water for peace. But a lot of people in the organization thought about it the other way around. Water is a priority, and if peace comes, that's great. And that was, I think, a tension, not for me, but for a lot of the staff. I think some people really care about the environment in itself, whilst other people have that peace building perspective of this is a way for us to get in, this is a way for us to get to peace. I think that to me was important, and I definitely could relate more to everyone who was more the peace building side from my experience and what I care about. I was working with the education team, and I think what really helped me is that during the conferences, in-person conferences, I was able to connect very well with not only my boss and my team, but also her counterparts in the Palestinian and the Israeli office. Funnily enough, with the Palestinian counterpart, I talked about mental health a lot, which is not something you talk about in Jordan, but we were able to bond over the fact that nobody talks about it, and anxiety, etc. And then my Israeli counterparts were actually Latin American, or kind of Latin American, but we would talk Spanish. It was very refreshing after talking in English for a long time. And I think that more personal side really allowed us all to connect and to make a lot of things happen. There's a lot of inner tension in the organization, which I think to me is just so crazy that it's not more prioritized because of that peace building program and perspective that we come from. But I think making those personal connections really allowed me to make some work happen. I did a lot of my work with my Israeli counterparts over Zoom. My Palestinian counterpart actually wanted me to come work with him, so it was just very nice. And I think I could definitely go back. My boss was trying to keep me. She was trying to find me a job. She wanted my boyfriend to get a job. She was like, how come we bring him here? What does he do? I can help you. But I think I was able to get around the tension a little bit.
Yeah, since, I think we learned in our peace building curriculum how important relationship building is. So it's nice to hear that you were able to leverage that into making your project come together and kind of ease tension between sort of different domestic and international ideas of peace building. Great. So my next question, I think, is a little tricky, but I'll start with Stevie for it. So, as students that are just entering the field of peace building, we might not necessarily have the same agendas as professionals coming from international organizations. I think for all of us, this experience was about getting that field experience and learning from that, rather than pushing forward like a agenda or trying to meet goals from a funder, for example. So do you think that being in this position as a student might be useful in bridging this gap that we're seeing in between domestic and international peace building and the different ideas that are floating around in there? Or do you think it makes it more difficult?
Yeah, I think being a student is beneficial for every reason, but especially just because I think we're in a unique space where there are so many amazing new ideas that are being thrown around every single day in this building, both by professors and peers. So I think it's really incredible to be in a student position and be able to be in that mindset of I'm here to learn and explore. And I think that it lends itself quite well to the fact that peace building is just as much art as it is science. You're able to kind of have that free flow mentality rather than someone who's working on behalf of an organization that has, smart goals that they need to achieve by X date. And, it allows you to be much more free form with what you bring to the table and what you take.
Anjali, do you have anything to add to the question?
I mean, it was interesting being a student. My background is from domestic organizations, working with children in from Baltimore for many years. So I mean, I can't speak for New York, but a lot of the organizations I worked for were very like structured and kind of bureaucratic. A lot of rules, a lot of like, you can't create a program, a lot of grant writing, a lot of that kind of work. Whereas this was a unique experience, kind of what you said, that we're students and like it was, I can't say, it was not an internship, obviously, but it was a unique position where we could share our ideas and have these meaningful discussions. We had so many discussions with our supervisor. Every day he would ask us 600 questions to peek into our mind and see what we had to say. But I think this opportunity really allowed a lot of self-reflection within those discussions, and a lot of, I hope that they learned a lot from us as well, from our perspective as students and our experiences and where we're coming from and like why we're interested in peace building itself. So
Yeah, I think I agree that being a student allows us this unique opportunity to to build those bridges across domestic and international peace building, what we're learning in the classroom and how the organizations we're working with are working. This kind of makes me think a little bit about the differences in working style that I encountered this summer in the multiple contexts that I worked in. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to maybe elaborate on sort of the benefits of maybe working with a local organization that's a little bit less structured in the traditional American or international NGO sort of way. What are kind of like the pros and cons of working in that sort of environment in advancing peace building with the community?
I think for me, definitely the conferences that I participated in helped me really realize that, because I think when I was doing a lot of facilitation and, you know, like big wind blows activity that we did in class a lot of them, I remember I had to do that. I mean, I didn't have to, I wanted to do that there. And I think something that I really learned in those conferences, when you're actually trying to get together people for peace building, when your goal is to get different people together, you have to be flexible. And I think what I thought was beautiful is at first I was very frustrated because I was like, oh my God, it's 10 a.m. We were starting at 9 a.m. Like, come on, like it's getting late. The schedule is, my boss would make this crazy detailed schedule. I was like, there's no way we're getting through this. But she at the same time was very flexible, and I thought that was very beautiful because we were able to allow one of the most impactful experience for me was working with youth. They were like 17 to 18 years old, and they became friends, and they were posting stories and Instagram and, you know, posting posts and Snapchatting and giving them the space to do that. I think maybe wouldn't have happened working here. Like it would have been, you know, just about going. And I think part of peace building is just being flexible and letting those relationships happen and then adjusting. And you have to adjust. And I thought that was, for that type of peace building, especially, I thought it was very valuable.
Thank you. So I'm just curious now. Well, Anjali said that this is her last semester at the CGA, and I think Stevie and Pia will be graduating in May, or maybe not. I don't know, one more semester, but you're time. I think we're all, you know, as students here in this very short program, thinking very much about our future. And I think a lot of us took this workshop so that we could get an understanding of what it's like to work in an international context. So I'd like to hear if your experience this summer motivated you to pursue international peace building, or if you think that you would be more useful and more comfortable working domestically. I'll start with Anjali on this one.
well, honestly, I mean, a part of me was a little selfish when I joined the class because I wanted to travel, obviously. But I saw some really beautiful stuff this summer that really inspired me. In Colombia, well, and in Uganda, obviously they have their own conflicts and their own settings, but it just, they care so much for their community, and they all work together to create this movement, and everyone is so passionate and ambitious about what's happening, and they work, it's so beautiful, I can't even explain it, like they just all come together to work on this cause that they really truly believe in, and for them, like peace building is just so natural, because this is something they truly believe in and something they want to change, and then it got me thinking. I don't even see it honestly anymore as international and domestic. I'm starting to see it more as there's different causes and people are just kind of like, there's been so many movements in the past few years that have just spiraled and really took off. And now they're just all these causes and it's kind of like, what are my interests now? What am I really interested in? And like, well, I haven't really told Tom about my thesis yet, but but it got me thinking into surprise. It got me thinking about my thesis and something I'm very interested in a cause, and I started thinking, who is my community? And I think I kind of gave like a sneak peek throughout this whole interview, but I'm very interested in first generation women of color, basically myself, but that is my community essentially. And I want to create a thesis to do something like that because I feel like that is a community I belong to. And this summer, all these communities that I watched grow and work together really inspired me to basically pursue something that they're doing too. So, but yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with me. Stevie? I think the beauty of this place is that I come back every semester and I have a new dream job because I just keep learning about these new career possibilities that I had never heard of previously. So this summer was amazing. It was so great to have this experience going abroad and working for a really small organization. But yeah, I really am not sure. I'm not sold on anything. I'm putting no chips down yet. I hope to one day find a cause like you that I'm really passionate about and that I could really follow. So right now I'm still very much in the exploratory phase of my career.
I would love to hear from you since you are in a unique position of being Argentinian, but being educated in the US now and then, working internationally in the Middle East. So where do you see maybe yourself ending up?
It's a hard question to finish a session. I think exactly like Anjali, for me, it's not about the place, it's more about the community. I think for me, I realized in this experience that some sort of connection to the people I was working with and was essential. I feel like I was able to connect on less levels than I would hope. Maybe like the language thing was huge, and I'm not sure that I would go again to work in the Middle East just because I feel like if I don't learn Arabic, there's so much I'm missing out on. But I think that if you find community and you find some sort of sense of belonging, your possibilities and the trust you can build just becomes huge. I think it's good to, not good, but it's okay to be different and it's okay not to be belonging exactly. It's sometimes good to have an outsider perspective, but I think some sort of belonging is essential. I think now I'm really thinking about going back home. I'm excited to start doing my capstone in Argentina and bringing a lot of the things I learned in my work. But again, open to jobs. But I think the community part is important in anything I do. I think it's more important than ever.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. And I think the language consideration that you bring up is super important. Being in Colombia this summer was definitely more of a struggle for me than being in Uganda since my Spanish is not as good as I thought it was. But in Uganda, most of the people we were working with spoke English. And so I did feel I was able to build that sense of community there, which seems essential. And I do have one more question. I think I might have an idea of how the three of you will answer this based on kind of your responses and what we learned about your experiences this summer. But Obviously, we are intrepid peace builders, as Tom likes to say, and we're very new to the field. But in your experience, do you see a tension between domestic and international peace building? And is that something that you felt this summer? Or at least framing it in terms of, what we learned in the classroom versus what was happening in the field?
I
Go
mean,
ahead, Pia.
Tom knows this, I think you all know this about me, but I don't like the word field, hate the word field, I think it makes no sense. I know there's no better word for it, we've had extensive conversations about how we could replace it, but there's I don't still have an answer, like, I've been struggling with this one, but I think it's all part of the same thing. There's not really a field, like, imagine if there was someone here working with us who had been working in the US, we would still be calling this reflections from field, but like again, like as with that word, I don't think there's really much of a barrier, because again, I don't think unless you've spent your whole life in one place and never left and have had an experience that's representative of the community that you're working with, which I'm not sure is the case for most of us, I don't think there's ever any domestic peace building. I think you're always part outsider, part insider. And I don't think there's ever fully anything domestic or international, So there's a lot of tension, but I don't believe it's real, I guess. And I do think peace building in the US is also important.
Stevie, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. I don't view domestic and international peace building initiatives as in competition with one another. I don't think that they should be. I don't think that it's a zero-sum game. And I wish that there wasn't this tension that exists, where you feel like as an American going abroad and working in the peace building field, internationally, you are somehow betraying your community at home. I don't think that that's necessarily true. As long as you're bringing positive things to the world, you're doing good.
Not too bad. And Anjali?
I could go on about this for a while, but I know we're running out of time. So, I mean, yeah, I think I agree with obviously both of you. I think for me, it was more so Western and non-Western rather than international and domestic. I mean, like I said, I think there are different causes, and then we are passionate about different causes. And I mean, international is like the UN, and who else has helped like international scale, big people who are helping international problems, and then domestic is like whichever government is supporting their causes. But for me, the summer was mostly like Western approaches versus non-Western approaches. So I think that's a whole other topic. Yeah.
Yes, which is definitely a whole other topic. But yeah, that brings us to the end of our panel. Just wanted to say thank you to our panelists for sharing their experiences. Thank you to our audience for listening.
Take one or two questions if anybody has a question.
Sure.
I'd like to know what were the key findings of the toolkit that you did? What resonated the most with you in terms of the trauma toolkit that you discovered?
Did everybody hear that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So her question was for Anjali, and it was, what were the key findings of the toolkit or training manual that Anjali put together this summer?
And you. Yeah. Well, so actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I was with INET, the African Youth Initiative Network. They have a GBV shelter. They're like, yeah, they have a GBV shelter and they have counselors. So most of our interviews were with their counselors to see what approach they took. They were post-conflict, so the guide was originally, I mean, I think Ali can explain this better, but if the guide was to explain during conflict and post-conflict. But we kind of had to write it from a perspective of the only information we had, which is post-conflict. So I mean, for me, what was really interesting is that there's a huge psychology component to it. And I mean, I didn't think mental health, I wasn't sure of Uganda's perspective on mental health, but to be fair, we only did interview counselors, so I got their perspective on it. But it was really interesting to hear about the techniques. It's a lot of, I mean, it's very similar to everyday like therapy techniques and what we learned from there. But I was interested to see what they would use towards survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And a lot of it has to do with just trauma and trauma care. And it's very important. And it's just a lot of perspectives they needed to take. For example, like if the counselor should be a woman, or, you know, just like very simple stuff. But it was really interesting to read about because a lot of it might seem like common sense, but it was really important to put in the guide. I don't know if that made sense, but Natalie, maybe you might have something better to add.
I think like the key findings from the toolkit, since it was coming from like an African perspective, that was definitely like a challenge for us. And we were sort of, you know, taking the information that they were giving us and putting it into just something that could be distributed to a wider audience. Their goal actually was to distribute this to mental health professionals working on the front lines in Ukraine. That's kind of where the inspiration for this idea came from. The supervisor realized that a lot of the mental health professionals there had never worked in a conflict situation, and they themselves were being traumatized by the Russian aggression and trying to help people who were also experiencing the same thing. And so that's very difficult, I think, when you're experiencing the conflict, how you can also help others work through that. And so I think that was sort of like the major key finding, that mental health professionals also need to take care of themselves to be able to help people who are suffering from the same things that they are. And the INEC counselors, because they worked immediately post-conflict and also had experience the conflict with the LRA, they recognized this, and that was something they really pushed and wanted to be in the guide. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from it.
I'm just interested about the process in class of developing the program project, and like the consultation that you had with the organization. Did it change when you got there? Like, yeah, how that worked, I guess.
I never heard someone like, they'll start looking at me and be like, they'll start looking at someone. I guess for me, the change was like, it was just 180, it was completely different. I was hoping to work on impact measurement of the programs that they are doing, the educational initiatives. I felt like they were not, I still feel like Eyako Heh is not really, they're not really translating the huge success that I think they are having. I think that their measures are very like donor related, like, okay, we did, you know, we have this amount of participants, but it's not really peace building indicators. So during the semester, I was actually trying to develop that, and I had trouble communicating with my supervisor. She is very, I think, not a Zoom person. So I think it was a bit hard, it's challenging, but I think I learned a lot from just trying to plan that out and just taking the initiative on some things, and her liking my ideas. And then getting there, I noticed that there was a lot more resistance than I thought there would be for that. Not from her, but from upper management. And also the issue of sustainability, like, okay, if you start that, is that sustainable? So I ended up shifting my focus more into the content building, which I felt as I got there was more of a pressing need, like having a bit of an outsider perspective and being able to compile these activities. So basically, 180. I'm sure that's it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the audience were in the workshop, and so if you want to, I'm assuming you're a first year student in this building. I think if anyone in the workshop wants to raise their hand.
I mean,
These are people that you can like, no, I'm just saying like after the panel, they can speak. Yeah, just to identify you guys, so you know who's active, you can ask questions too, about the more technical aspects.
I will tell you, it was an exhilarating process. And we're in the surprise, but you're really in for a treat. The whole process was super exciting. So. But you have choices and you can do your research. But everyone will tell you that.
Highly recommend choosing based on the organization, not the location. Don't be someone who's like, I want to go here, so I don't care what the work is. Like it's definitely there's so many pieces that come together. What expertise are you bringing to the table? What do they need as an organization? And what skills from the workshop are you able to bring? So finding that kind of nexus in the middle of all of that is where you're going to be doing your work.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is your last one, but my only advice is to be super open-minded about everything. Like don't be like, this is my background and this is what I want to do. I mean, sure, keep that into mind too, but try to be as open-minded as you can, because this whole process is more about self-reflection and finding out who you are and what you want to do, and career building, of course. But
So not a question, but just a comment from the Zoom chat that I'm monitoring over here from Professor Sylvia Mayer. Thank you, Ali, Anjali, Stevie, and Pia for sharing your experiences and honest reflections with us.
Thank you. All right, a couple of minutes, we're going to shift panels now, and so I'll invite the students to take the practitioner panel.
What's your name? I'm sorry. I'm Anjali. Nice to meet you.
I know, I'm aware.
Sorry. I know, I'm like, keep that in mind.
I just feel like all the
Yeah, I do remember
Okay. I liked your maintaining mystery.
I was like, freeze. Someone's
Exciting. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks again to the fantastic student panel. That was really wonderful. And so now we're going to move on to our, it's funny, I used to call it the seasoned practitioners panel. When I look around here, I'm thinking that's not really good, right? Wait, was doing me maybe, I don't know. You too, I think you're still the future. You have the whole future ahead of you. Exactly. So I'm not going to full introductions to everyone because everybody has bios for you in print. So I'll just start off by saying, first of all, that I'm thrilled that we're able to do this again. I'm thrilled that the three of you were able to join us today. Two panelists who came all the way from Washington, D.C., which we haven't been able to do in a long time. So it's great that you're here with us. You heard a little bit on the first panel about the students talking about this tension between global and domestic peace building. And I think this is something that we've been hearing about, those of us who work in the field for quite a while. And I know even as a faculty member here, there is this constant tension between students wondering why they're going abroad to do peace building work, whether they should be staying here. And I'm looking at and seeing even some of our alums who were working internationally and now are working domestically. So I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room who have something to say about this. But of course, this all seemed to become much, much more serious around the time of the 2016 election, and then leading up to 2020 with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, which I think really just brought the sort of the questions around the need for peace building in the United States. Made it much, much starker, I think, for all of us. I've started seeing, like I said, I've seen this tension manifest in our students who want to work globally, but sometimes feel that they're needed here in the US. So what I hope we can do, spend the rest of the time together doing this evening, is having a conversation, which I think will come up. These are one of the things that we probably don't do enough here now in the United States, have conversations. Liz and I spoke earlier today. We talk at each other. We don't necessarily speak with each other. And so hopefully we can do that. We can sort of turn back the clock on this a little bit. And so what I'd love to do is to start off this evening by just asking each of you to say briefly, how do you understand the tension between global and domestic peace building, or how does it affect you or affect your work, if it does? And I don't know, we'll do this not democratically. Eyako, would you like to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the way in which I understand it, when it comes to peace building, I feel as if a lot of peace building, when we talk about it, at least, it isn't necessarily focused on the UX context. A lot of the frameworks, a lot of the language, a lot of the funding, a lot of the work is usually done internationally. So I think, because there's this a focus on international perspectives when it comes to peace work, there's this sort of tension that arises because in order for us to begin peace work at home, I think it's to first acknowledge that our society is unstable in social, economic, and political facets. And that can be uncomfortable for people. That can be something that we're not willing to address. The fact that our institutions can be fragile. We saw that on January 6th. We saw that with police brutality and other issues as well. But the fact of the matter is, we've been living in a post-conflict society since Reconstruction, and there is the capacity for violence within our society today. And I think, in order to reconcile domestic and international frameworks and language around peace building, maybe it's time that we advance language that's used internationally and bring it in a more international, a more domestic sense. right? So that's my understanding of it at least. And of course, you know, I'm very new to the field. I started at BDI, Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University about 4 months ago. So this is all like very new to me, I suppose. But I think if we are to begin talking domestically about peace building, it's to reconcile that fact that institutions can be stable, or I guess like unstable, and that like requires work at home as well.
So I have a little bit of a different perspective. I feel this tension personally. I feel a lot of anguish in myself towards this push and pull of working domestically or internationally. And I feel that my worldview and my drive towards nonviolent activism and peace building was really shaped by 9/11 and focusing on doing right by the Muslim world, according to the wrongs that the US and its allies have committed. When I returned to the US in 2020, it was a huge pivot. I had to face my own biases. I'm still facing them. And to try and reconcile with this need to continue work that I was doing abroad, while also seeing the US starting to really fall apart, to be honest. And knowing that I'm a part of it and I need to focus my efforts as well as my organization's efforts on trying to support work here in the domestic sphere, while also not still neglecting our international partners.
So I look at it in a way that we're all interconnected. That's what we're seeing, whether it be COVID, whether it be the war in Ukraine and the economic sanctions, we are all interconnected. And we cannot divorce our domestic policy and our foreign policy. So I honestly don't sit and actually think about it. However, when I first, many years ago, when I was in my late 20s, I went to Bosnia right after the war and felt incredibly guilty because I could get on a plane and go home, right? So I think that's, that kind of guilt exists, but we are all interconnected and we are not exceptional here in the United States. What is driving our conflict here are the same grievances that are driving conflict in other places in the world. So I honestly just don't sit up at night, thinking about it. What I do deal with in terms of the tension between international and domestic peace builders is the fact internationally, we've been doing this work for decades now. It has been funded, bazillions of dollars have gone into this research, to the programs. In the past 3 decades, we have learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. And what does keep me up at night is the fact that, especially since 2016, many domestic organizations here in the US have popped up. And I have a good idea. And these good ideas actually are not based on any evidence or social science, and we know that they could cause harm. And at the very least, they're taking up very precious resources from other programs that we know could work. So that's really, I think, one of the things that I'm most concerned about. And then the fact that there's a lot of tension in the international peace builders, like myself, who are starting to do work here in the US. Because we don't practice what we preach. We're very, not very humble. And also, this is a conflict here in the US, so it's hard, we're part of it. And we don't realize how we are part of it and how we're driving it ourselves. And, the memes we do, and the jokes we do, and the, ew, I don't want to work with those people. And I always tell people that if you can't do that, don't go to Bosnia and Srebrenica and tell people that they have to reconcile if you can't do the same work here.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, no, I mean, you know, I'm in agreement. So I think what we're hearing then is that there's clearly much to be learned. This dichotomy may be a bit of a false one, but it's one that's causing tension, stress, and guilt among people who are working in the peace building field. So I'm wondering if we could think a little bit about what actually can we learn? Liz, you mentioned just now that there's domestic organizations you've seen that are well-meaning, trying to address some of the tensions and the divides that we're facing domestically. But what should these organizations also be learning? And I want to flip this around for each of you because, no surprise, this panel was chosen intentionally, very carefully. And, Liz, you're representing an organization of members who largely work globally. Eyako, I think your work is very domestically focused. And as I understand it, Isabella, you sit somewhere in the middle, you just said. So I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, what ought the domestic workers be learning? What should they be learning from the people who have been working globally for all these decades? And is there something that the global workers can be learning from the domestic?
Yeah,
sure.
So when I think about that, I think about like my own work at BEI, right? And I don't like to use the term like expert. I don't know if I'm necessarily an expert in anything, or if any of us are an expert in anything at all. So like when we're working with local communities, like the microgeographies of that, like they know what is most impactful within their own communities, right? Like I do a lot of quantitative work. Some of the data sets that we use at BEI, the armed conflict location and event data set, crowd counting consortium, like these different data sets that track political violence, different developments throughout the world, but also like in the United States, they're missing a lot of like information, right? Like data can't capture everything. So when you're talking to like an election official in a particular area, right, and you present this data and you say that like, okay, there's been 3 protests within the past year that have had militia actors present, they're gonna look at you and be like, that doesn't sound right. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't necessarily correlate with like my lived experience here in the community. So like as researchers, I think that like when you're going into local communities, right, like you're uplifting them. You're not there to tell them like how they're supposed to actualize policy or how they're supposed to actualize initiatives. You're just there to fill in information gaps, for example. And I think that's something that like the previous panel was talking about, right? Like when you're doing international work, you're not there to tell people what to do. You're there to uplift their voices in a way and maybe provide like a Western perspective on how you can go about peace building. So I think like, like you said, it's not a dichotomy. And there's a lot of synergies between international and domestic peace building. But I think centering communities is what should transcend both. What should speak to both is the community experience.
Sure. This is a very interesting question for the work that I do and my organization does. So we primarily train and conduct consulting work to help individuals and groups learn capacity in strategic nonviolent struggle. So really helping them to develop a strategy around a social movement and to almost induce a conflict in order to create positive change. And the big piece that I've come across since returning to the US and doing work domestically is a sense of American exceptionalism. And it's made it very difficult to kind of pull lessons learned and really successful campaigns and organizations from all over the world and to bring that back to the US and to say we can learn from others. That's something that I run into quite a lot. And I think that when we think about that dichotomy not quite existing, this is where it feels more obvious in actually existing because people feel it. They feel that they are exceptional and that there's a difference in what's going on in the rest of the world compared to the US. So I think that there's so much to learn and it's worth a bit of humility to look abroad and to say, yes, In Sudan, they were inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, but guess what? We can turn that back and we can learn from the Sudanese and the resistance movements and what they did to achieve their revolution and now their transition.
So at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, we're a membership-based organization. So we have over 170 organizational members, big Mercy Corps, Search for Common Ground, your center here. So in 2015, when I joined AFP, it was in our charter that we didn't work in the United States. And I thought, well, that's kind of hypocritical given what's going on in our own backyard. And I had come back, I'd been overseas in Africa living, and it was palpable. In 2015, the tensions, it was very palpable. And we started talking about it at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I got a lot of, oh, Liz, don't bring your conflict, you see everything through a conflict lens here. We did change our charter, and we have a lot of members that are also working in the United States and have been working in the United States, and a lot of new members that are working in the US. So there is a lot of work that has been going on in the US. So that I need to be very clear. My issue is, and I totally agree with you, that there is this exceptionalism, and I don't want to hear what they did over in the DRC, because our wealth and power really does mask our fragility. However, I think the biggest issue around this of what's happening is that working overseas, you have USAID, you have the UN, you have the World Bank, you have all these institutions that have really high, I don't want to say high standards, but really tough proposals, and you have to tell why you're working here. What's your theory of change? What's your goal? These are the activities you're going to do. You're going to be held accountable for auditing. You're going to have to prove metrics of change. How is it going to be sustainable? Do no harm. Okay, there's no USAID here in the United States. There's no UN. So what you're seeing is this kind of like Wild West that happened since 2016. And a lot of private donors are funding a lot of these projects, and I call them the good idea. We cannot talk our way out of this conflict. And a lot of donors get very excited about bringing a Republican and a Democrat into a room together and will be civil. And I've attended a lot of those events, and I've walked out more polarized. And we know it doesn't work. And even just recently, I got a draft of a bill from somebody on Capitol Hill, and I called them and said, you can't do this. Like, this doesn't even reflect any of the decades of work that the US government has paid for itself, right? So that I think is really, I think, some of the big struggles that, that I'm dealing with.
Fantastic. So a lot of people in this room know that I'm a stickler for language. And because the words we choose to describe things says a lot about how we understand them, and also how we sort of apply our ideas. So I'm wondering, when we think about what we do, how we talk about what we do, and I don't know, I have an idea that maybe between domestic and global work, there are some differences in the language. Certainly I encounter it all the time. I go to places where people tell me, well, we love what you're doing, but we can't call it peace building because that's a dirty word here. I'm wondering if each of you could share a little bit about how you talk about your work and whether do you use, Liz, you run the Alliance for Peacebuilding, you can't avoid it. But even if you wanted to. But do you use that word, or is there a problem with that word? And how do you describe your work in a way that it can be as expansive as possible and as welcoming as possible to as many people as possible?
So that is a great question. And we just finished some incredible narrative research. And we worked with social scientists, PhD, people that look at markets, like, you know, I don't know, dentists or something, you know, because we wanted to know, how do we talk about this field better? Because we're doing a really bad job at it, and partly because you and I can get really wonky and technical and people's eyes glaze over. But how do we, everybody knows what the World Wildlife Fund does. Everybody knows what the Diabetes Association does. So what do we know about our narrative research that talk to Americans? One, you have to talk about it in terms of actively what you're doing, the interconnectedness of it. Those are key. This active, you know, you're bridge building, but you're not building a bridge just to talk to people. You know, it's an active piece. And stop with the crisis messaging. And actually, we've even done it here. We started with the negatives, right? Instead of talking about what's working, what is resilient. And so that's something that I'm really struggling with, because I want to start and say, social cohesion in the United States has been going down since 2014, and we're at a 30-year high in global violent conflict. You all want to like crawl into your chairs, right? So that's how our brains work. So that's really what we're trying to do, is think about it in that way.
I love that, and I think it's amazing. In my line of work, the term peace building is completely off limits. I do not use it. I do not refer to it because people do not want to hear it. I tend to work with individuals when they are in an incredibly dire state and are looking for either a violent strategy or potentially something else to achieve their goals. And to that end, introducing something like peace building that comes with a lot of assumptions and a lot of personal connotations for those individuals is not a positive way to move the conversation forward. So I use a lot of terms that touch on peace building and are centered around peace building, but I repackage it in a way that's palatable for that audience. So things like being a change maker and having positive developments and focusing on your own agency and dispersing democratic norms. These are much more of the terms that I'll use, and we'll focus on things like horizontal and vertical negotiations, which, to be honest, is pure peace building. But again, would never refer to it that way. It's much more around coalition building. And I think part of that is because a lot of the individuals I work with wouldn't necessarily characterize themselves as being in a conflict yet. And some of them also want to remove themselves from that. So I'm thinking, I worked with a group of Afghan activists last year, and they really wanted to segregate themselves from the war and what was going on between the Taliban and the government, and they wanted to focus on the entire context. So turning to them and saying, let's do some peace building in addition to nonviolent activism, it didn't feel quite appropriate. If anything, focusing on the activism was able to embolden their agency and really focus on that side.
Before you go, let me ask you, can you put your finger on why you get the blowback about the word peace building?
Sure. The line I hear is, that's way too feely. We're not hippies. We're here to make a difference and we want change right now. So, I mean, a good example would be resources, right? So if I'm meeting with individuals and they want to feed their families and their families are starving to death, a term like peace building, there's an assumption of time that comes with it. right? And it's a much easier sell in my regard to say, if you start up a movement and you overthrow that minister and change the policy, you'll be able to get access to some aid, and then you'll have your resources and you'll be able to feed your family.
Great, thank you.
Can I just say one thing? Do you also hear, we're not in a violent conflict here? Is that?
It depends. It depends on the situation. Yeah, it depends on the scenario.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, kind of building off of that. I don't know if I've ever used the term peace building in my own work. I think we focus more on like political violence, and we kind of frame it in negative terms of like mitigating political violence and building community resiliency against, you know, threats within the community, outside the community, that sort of thing. And what I find to be interesting, and you know, political violence too can also be like a very loaded term, right? Like conflict is something that people like might not want to admit is endemic or happening within their immediate like society, but like political violence too is also something that can shock people and be like, are we living in a state of conflict? Are we living in a state of political violence? And when it comes to definitions in terms, like we were saying earlier, like as a researcher, you know what I mean? Like political violence might mean something different to me based off like, you know, my training, my expertise, but also on like my lived experience. And it can mean something very different to people like live in the community as well, right? Like when I think about political violence, I think about anti-LGBT sentiment. I think about like, you know, like white supremacist activity, that sort of thing. But when you talk to, you know, like through our conversations, when you talk with like local stakeholders, people within community organizers, that sort of thing, they might conceptualize political violence as, you know, housing discrimination, like affordability, police violence, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, we operationalize a lot of these terms and kind of deploy them in various capacities in different ways, but they're so peculiar to the individual. They're so peculiar to the circumstance, and I think that's important to remember.
So I think you bring up a really, really good point here that I've heard sort of come up in small ways so far in this conversation. And that's this, you know, as Liz said, there's this tendency to start focusing on the negative, right? Focusing on the, and I talk about this, students in the room know in my classes, our eyes are drawn to the sort of the spectacular, right? Which is the violence. So how do we, whether it's domestic or international, do what we keep saying as practitioners that we need to do, but don't do enough, which is talk about building resilience and building capacity and focusing on local capacities for peace and all of these things that we know. But we keep going back, you know, it's like a knee-jerk reaction, right? We all go back and we start talking about the violence again, we start talking about the conflict. Why, you know, why does that keep happening in your view? Do you see that happening in your work? And how do we overcome?
Well, I think in the US, it's a little, it's weird. It's really weird because you have people wanting to say there's nothing to see here. Everything's good as long as I'm making money and, you know, my neighborhood's good. What do I have to worry about? But at the same time, January 6th happened. You cannot deny that. We are sliding down in indices. I mean, the Fragile States Index, the Economist, you know, we're a fragile democracy. I mean, you name it, we're sliding down. I mean, 14 years straight of social cohesion declining on the Fragile State Index is a freight train going in the wrong direction. But what we need to do is understand what's really driving the conflict. What are the real grievances? And then what is resilient about our society? And that, I think, is what you have to, you know, apply this conflict assessment framework that, you know, I helped design in the US government that we've applied all over the world. And when you do it here in the United States, it doesn't look good. However, if you're not in denial and you can understand what's driving the conflict, if you can, you know, accept the problem, that's half of it, right? Then you can start applying solutions. So I think, you know, again, really quickly, we talked about this earlier, you know, people in the US, fear is really driving this conflict here. We're trying to do something in the US that's never been done. Create a multicultural democracy, and someone's gonna lose power. And that's really scary, and that's actually a logical thing to be afraid of. So if we know that, can we now have empathy for it? Maybe, not like it, not agree with it, but then start being able to have the conversations and understand what we have to do to fix it. Recognizing that there's structural, discrimination, structural racism are also part of the conflict dynamic, but it is a system and we have to work on all of it.
Yeah, I'd love to build off of something that you said there, Liz, that kind of fear of the unknown almost, right? And that's a key topic that I touched on, and something that's been the center of my conversation with a lot of activists and those that are coming into their tenure as activists here in the US. And the idea is that fear of the unknown can drive an emotional response to things, and that includes taking up violence. I personally find that to be a very emotive response over taking something more logical, like a nonviolent response, which has a higher rate of success. Now, I think in the US, what's challenging about it, and what I find in my conversations, is that the reality is that there is an increase in violence on the ground, and everybody's feeling it. It felt like it came about in a tidal wave with the racial justice unrest that happened over 2020, and then it just kept building with the January 6th, and now it seems that there's so much media attention around rising crime, as well as the rise in gun violence and gun purchasing. So absolutely, I mean, that's part of the reason why we're kind of fixated, right, on the violence, because it's there and it's increasing. But I think that for me, my goal is to always sit down with those individuals that are starting to look toward taking up violence and partaking in it and feeling that they can combat other violence with more violence by saying that there are alternates, there's ways that you can continue to resist and ways that you can build things that don't involve violence.
Yeah, kind of building off of that, I think the biggest question here is like, how do we acknowledge the fact that like there is increasing violence in society without leaning into like sensationalist narratives? I think, immediately about like the whole Civil War narrative, for example, like that doesn't necessarily do anything conducive to like advance peace within society, I think at least. Like at BDI a few months ago, in the wake of like the League of Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, we released an issue brief where we looked at offline mobilization, protest, and that sort of thing, like following the League decision. And there were a lot of narratives that were being pushed on like right-wing outlets about a night of rage following the overturn of Roe v. Wade, how pro-abortion rights activists would engage in like increased violence and that sort of thing. But like what we found through the data is that like that largely did not materialize. But like that was pushed on right-wing forums, that was pushed out to the wider world, and like that created a certain narrative that like shaped reality. Kind of going back to what you were saying about gun violence, I saw a really interesting graphic a couple weeks ago that demonstrated, or I guess showcased like the amount of times that gun crimes were mentioned in the media versus the amount of gun crimes that were actually happening on the ground. And there was a stark difference. So the media obviously plays like a big role in shaping narratives and how they're perceived and that sort of thing. I know we can all think back to the uprisings in the summer of 2020 following George Floyd's death. Tucker Carlson, like other right-wing pundits talk ad nauseum about how cities were burning, how people were like looting and rioting and that sort of thing. And this was before I joined BDI, I think I actually did this analysis. 93% of protests during that summer were peaceful, but you still see it to this day, but like the idea that like entire cities were burning down and there was chaos and all this sorts of things. So I think it's really a matter of like striking a nice balance between acknowledging the fact that there's instability in society, acknowledging the fact that there needs to be like on the ground work, meaningful work to like address this increase in violence and make sense of it, you know, like the drivers that you were saying earlier, like what are those drivers of political violence and instability, but not leaning into sensational narratives.
Great, thank you, thank you. So I think you're raising a good point, and it's really coming a bit from all of you, because we're talking about some power imbalances here, right? We're talking, you're mentioning the media, we're mentioning the sort of narratives that are emerging, and you know, a big topic, at least among practitioners and activists over the last couple of years, has been around two things that I see as closely linked: the idea of decolonization and the idea of localization, right? And people talk about them in different ways, but there's, you know, there's a real linkage here, because what it's ultimately about is about shifting, you know, the balance of power, right? I'm wondering how each of you see that in your own work, and whether that is actually, is that leading us down a road to further tension and you know, and conflict, or are sort of the localization agenda, decolonizing aid and peace building, is that a way out of what we're facing right now?
What do you mean by that, in terms of a way out from
Well,
what we're talking about internationally?
Is it the path towards, you know, getting away from the power imbalances? I mean, because ultimately that's the long-term goal, right? But is this just something that we're going to be talking about for a couple of years, or is there actually some opportunity here to, you know, to shift? I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking about USAID, right? They're saying
25%.
25%, right? But by 2025?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So,
It's not gonna happen.
okay. So,
There aren't enough awards out there
Right.
to do that.
right. And we don't know what it means, right? We don't have a definition for localization.
Right. Yeah.
But is this path now? You look like you were actually a little less, we're gonna bite on this, weren't you?
Just thinking.
Okay, okay.
I'll bite on
Okay,
it.
go ahead.
I think from my perspective, and to be fair, like, one of the key pieces with the work that I do, so I have my personal activism, and I'll insert my opinions there and pursue causes that are important to me, but in my work and with my organization, we have a very strict rule that we only work with those that approach us. Which, I mean, is part of the decolonization line, if you ask me, because I have no interest in going to a group and saying, this is how you're gonna take down your government. I mean, you can't export a revolution. So we have to wait for them to come to us, and then we're able to confer together and develop a solution together. But with that said, it feels like in a lot of the activist groups I'm working with that this line of decolonization is absolutely there. And in the US context, that focuses around the hegemony of white men. And that is absolutely a tension that I am concerned about in terms of the backlash that will come from that. So with movements I'm seeing that are pursuing this, if they're successful in their campaigns and they're able to root out some of these individuals, I have concerns about them replying in a violent manner and potentially triggering more violence. Yeah, I think that's generally kind of the sense, and it's not something that's absolute. It really depends on how a campaign is executed and how negotiations go about, and if it's inclusive after the fact, and if you're pulling in those individuals. But again, going back to my comment on the American exceptionalism, it's been very challenging in our work so far to work with activist groups and to help find a middle ground that doesn't focus so squarely on that decolonization as a means to avoid triggering some kind of violence.
So I can just say on the locally led, it is really important because there are a lot of local organizations in the communities, whether it be Uganda or that should get more funding and get more resources. But it's not only about that, it's about decision-making, that they're really part of the process. And we put out a policy that talks about the unsexy things, is what I call it, that have to get done, and it's like around procurement reform. I mean, who wants to talk about procurement reform? I do. I mean, that's what it takes, right? And so that's what you're talking about. It's just decision making and making sure that they're part of the process. Here in the United States, again, we are not exceptional, and we have to recognize that there's, you know, a continuum that people are on, and they're sliding in and out of it. And there are, just like in Somalia, there are some very bad people in Al-Shabaab that, you know, there's a, you know, a military or a, you know, a security response. We have that here, right? That you need, you know, there's some people that need to be arrested for what they're doing. Okay, that's a separate thing. We can't get there, right? I'm not going out and trying to like work with Al-Qaeda. I'd be arrested because I'd be against the material support laws under the US government. We're not doing that. And we don't have that prohibition here in the US. But what you want to do is get to people in the middle, just like what you said. That, you know, they're sliding into violent extremism. That's where you want to be pulling people out, right? You want to get them before they go into it. And that, I think, is where our work can be done. And we know mental health is part of it. Having a cause. I mean, why do people a lot of times become Al-Qaeda or ISIS? Because they want a cause, right? You know, it's the same here. So I think it's really looking at that prevention programming.
Yeah, when I think about it, you know, I think you have to ask yourself what exactly you mean by decolonizing peace building. So like, when I think about it, I suppose I think about it in the language of like bipartisanship, you know what I mean? And ever since like 2016, I feel as if there's been such, and this is speaking like a personal capacity, but there's been such a deterioration of like basic values, of democratic values within the Republican Party on the right. And it's like, am I willing to reach across the aisle and work with people who quite frankly want me dead, type of thing? Is that something I'm willing to do? And the answer is no. And so I think like that is the root of it, is that like I'm, you know, like it is a very, not good at my words today, but like it's just like the idea of bipartisanship, I think, can be decolonized in a sense, or is like, we want to use alternative language. I was having a conversation yesterday with my director about the, you know, language of like reconciliation, for example, but that implies that like there were two equal parties that had symmetry. So when we're talking about like reparations, for example, for, you know, the descendants of formerly enslaved people, are we using the language of like reconciliation? Or are we using the language of like reparations? And those two things are like very different. So I think language is important. I think narratives are important, like I was pointing out earlier. And I think when we talk about decolonizing, we got to think about what exactly we are decolonizing.
That's a great point. I think you know, all three of you just made me think of this. Now that I'm going to get wonky on it for a second, but like you were saying, Liz, about the procurement issue, right? Terribly boring stuff.
Not sexy.
Terribly boring stuff. But it's exactly what our friend Robert Sigliano talks about when he's talking about transactional behaviors, right? So it's that idea of how do you achieve structural and attitudinal change? It's through those transactions. And I think you're talking about the same thing when you're saying bipartisanship. It's, you know, very simply in Washington, do these people from the two parties interact in the way that they did in the past? And they do not, we know that, right? Whether it's, you know, professionally or socially or just in terms of public discourse, it doesn't happen any longer. And so that's actually a mechanism there. I wonder how that can be activated.
Well, the Global Fertility Act that the Alliance for Peacebuilding and Mercy Corps pushed started in 2016, and it was adopted by everyone. There was one senator, I won't say who it is, who did not vote for it. This was a foreign assistance. This was a massive reform of, you know, locally led, 10 years. And Senator Coons and Senator Lindsey Graham were the sponsors in the Senate. So I totally get what you're saying. And sometimes I get it, and you can only imagine how upset I am over jobs, for example. But I think what we need to do is I have seen so many countries slide into violence and, set back decades in development. People's lives are lost. I mean, what violent conflict does, you never want to see that. We don't want that here. Do we want change? Do we want structural change? Do we want people, but so we need to make sure that we have a society where we can keep working on that and make sure that we don't have violent conflict. At the same time, and this is not going to be popular, we also have to look inside ourselves. I did a session at the Alliance for Peacebuilding last summer called "What's the Left Got to Do with It? Toxic Polarization." And Erica Edelson she has a great book out, and she showed, and there was massive, there was like 200 people on this Zoom call, and a lot of international peace builders. And she was putting up all these memes. We've all seen them, we've all shared them, we've all laughed at them. And it was saying like, would you ever do this in another country? And the answer is no, I would have never, like I was, when I was working in Bosnia, I'd be like, no, you can't do that. But why is it okay to do it here, right? Why is it okay? I mean, I've told Tom these stories. I mean, I'm on Facebook, I get yelled at and called a Karen if I say, hey, let's ask the question why Republicans are going less in numbers to college. Let's just ask why, right? And I've been accused of being, this horrible Karen troll, right? So we need, could be, but we need to, and I'm okay with that. I'm like, call me a Karen all day long. But if let's say I'm in the middle, how do you just push that person like, see, those people are crazy. So that's what it's really, we need to do a lot of intra-group work before we can even get to intergroup. But I ask people, what are you doing that is driving this conflict, and what can you do to stop?
Kind of going into that really quickly, what you said made me think about how, kind of going back to the Dobbs decision, abortion, reproductive rights, that sort of thing. I was seeing a lot of things online, a lot of like, either they're leftists or they're in like liberal spaces, like kind of having this like abandonment sort of like ideal where they're like, oh, like those are just red states, like, we're not there to help them, like, that's just how they are type of thing. And I don't think that's conducive to like social change. It's not conducive to cohesiveness, that sort of thing. Like when I'm talking about not willing to reach across the aisle with certain people, it's, the people that are in power who are like advancing, racist, homophobic narratives, and they're aware of it type of thing. And like their narratives are influencing people who are like, aren't in positions of power. But I do think that like, if we believe that a better world is possible, and like we're in this peace building space, we have to be optimists. And in order to be optimists, we have to believe in the will of people to change, people to be transformed, and that sort of thing. So I don't think like, we should go around saying that we should abandon, people that are living in red states. That's not, I think, conducive.
You have something you want to add?
I
Isabella?
do.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So, one of the mechanisms that we like to use in strategic nonviolence for that, breaking down the bipartisan, is to find a common cause that both sides care about. And the universal cause these days is climate activism. Everyone is feeling it. Everyone knows what the basic resources are. When the student panel was talking about some of their pieces in Creo, and you're talking about water. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that you can build that immediate bridge is to say, we all need water and we don't have any. So we need to come together and figure it out right now. And I've found that individuals on two different sides of whatever the cause is, coming together and being able to problem solve and achieve something like that, even if it's a small feat, it's something that can really help to build some interdependence. You don't have to love the other person, but you can acknowledge that they can be in your community, you can support their business, they can support yours, and you don't agree with each other's opinions, but you still move forward.
Great. Well, I promised a conversation, and I think we've dominated the conversation here. But we're coming to the end of our scheduled time together, but I do want to open this up to those of you out here who may have thoughts to share or questions to ask. Would use one of the mics just so our friends who are watching on Zoom can hear your question. But if you have anything, this mic here in the middle works. Do we have questions, comments? We just wow you so much that you have no way of responding. Brian, please, take the mic.
Oh, hi. Okay. So, hi, I'm Brian. I mean, first, it's not appropriate to talk about this because I'm from China, and from my country's perspective, especially the country's official perspective, we want America slide down quickly because we are the only one can hold the war in the future. But let me go back. Just talking about the bipartisanship. Like yesterday in our peacebuilding class, I also talked about that. Like now, Democrats move much further to left, and Republicans move much further to right. So there is no way to cooperate. Even like 50% of the Republican senators, I think it's Republican voters, they don't consider Russia invading Ukraine is a big issue. And how could they agree upon other issues like foreign policy? And Russia is like so many years enemy of the US, and they couldn't agree upon. So how could they agree upon other things? And we're talking about like finding a common cause to build peace quickly, but like just one side, there seems no way to find that common cause of things. So how could we just like quickly to find a way to help to build peace in this country? Yeah.
Okay, that's a big question.
Well, first, if you look at Beyond Conflict, a phenomenal organization based in Boston, they have great research, and it's based on neuroscience. And what they have found is we are actually not as divided as we think we are. And that, I think, is a really important point. Remember what's getting sensationalized, and it's up to all of us to act differently. And I will tell you, it is really, really hard. And there's a lot of humility here. Because in 2016, I can tell you, I was not feeling this way. I have looked inside myself and tried to practice what I'm preaching as well. And that, I think, is so important that you have to kind of start with yourself, but ask yourself, what can you do? Okay, listen, there's solutions journalists. Listen, we have a podcast out with Amanda Ripley, and she talks about the crisis in media and what you can choose to listen to or not, how you can respond to somebody on Facebook or not, right? And I think those are small things, I get it. And there's a lot of really tough problems in the US, but I would also say funders have to fund the programs. We're funding lots of programs internationally, and I think we should continue because we know we're so interconnected. But the Department of Homeland Security grants for 1 year is $20 million to work on prevention of violent extremism. In the entire United States, And our national security people have told us violent extremism is one of the greatest threats to national security. Okay, so we're gonna, $20 million, that's gonna get you nowhere. So if you don't resource it, you can't do it. That's my biggest plea to funders.
I agree, Liz. I think that something as well, we don't have to search too hard to find common cause or common interests between Democrats and Republicans. We're all human. We all want to ensure that our families are taken care of, and we want prosperity in our country. And I think that there's enough common ground that if we take the time and we're intentional about it, we can find solutions together. It certainly isn't easy. And it takes time to overcome it. It takes arguments and back and forth. But I think that one of the ways that we can pull that together is focusing on moderates on both sides of the line. They have a nice way of sometimes pulling those hardliners towards them.
Yeah, I don't know if I have like anything robust to add, but I do think that like framing is really important. So like not talking about policy, for example, in terms of like, oh, Republicans want this, Democrats want this. It's more so like, what are the material things that like people need in life? Because at the end of the day, like when there's an economic crisis and someone is and communities are disenfranchised, although it might impact, people, one person more than the other, I think at the end of the day, we all still want the same things, like Liz was saying. So how do we talk to people, not in this sort of like, oh, like, this is the left, this is the right, but like, what can we do to like advance our own collective and individual prosperity? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that like labels can do more harm than good sometimes.
I like that all three of you kind of tried to bring Brian's level of despair down. Anybody else? Rosalind?
Hi, thank you. Really interesting panel. And as someone who works with an organization, we work with a network of women peace builders, primarily globally, but we're trying to think of how to do this work more domestically. So very relevant to some of the things I've been thinking through. And I love the point about climate action as a way to bring people together, because a lot of the women that we work with have during COVID took on the role, not just of peace builders, but also of first responders. And now with all the climate disasters happening, like in Pakistan, they're taking on the role of responders to those disasters and those conflicts in their community because they're there and that's what they do. And we found that actually their skills in peace building and the relationships that they have formed during their peace building work help them do that kind of response work better because they knew the communities, they know who to talk to, they know who to access, and then in turn, their humanitarian work and relief that they provided helped them do their peace building better because they built more trust by giving aid to a specific community. They started kind of weaving that into like some of the dialogue things that they were doing and using it as an entry point basically for their peace building. So that's just a comment. But my question was, aside from things like climate action, what are some things that bring you hope and energy in the US context? Are there some things that you're seeing that are going on right now that you're saying, this is inspiring, this is positive change towards peace? For just to answer my own question, for me, for example, the labor movement that's going on right now, and a lot of the labor organizing, the strikes, unionizing, people recognizing, look, we want a higher wage, and that's a way of organizing across differences, across political alignment is very inspiring. So wondering from where you're sitting, if there's anything else that's really bringing you kind of hope and energy in your work.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to talk about the labor movement. I mean, even today, when I took the Amtrak up to New York City, there was that threat of like, yeah, there's a strike that would happen that would prevent me from being here today. But I think like, regardless of that, like in Columbus, where I'm from Ohio, there was the largest teacher strike since I believe like the 1990s that happened. And you see it like across the country with like the Starbucks organizers and that sort of thing as well. I think, like you were saying, that the fact that like people, regardless of their political leanings, are organizing around labor, I think that brings me a lot of hope personally. So
gonna be so corny, all of you bring me hope. And I'm not kidding, like students and student activists are the ones that bring me so much hope. Everyone that I come across that kind of fits that profile just has so much energy and is really passionate. And I think that even us all just sitting here today and having this conversation, I know Tom, Katerina, when we were speaking, there was this focus on, okay, what are we gonna do here in New York then? What's our activism going to be on the side, right? And that gives me hope. People are trying to affect change so that we can save our country. And I have a lot of hope around that.
So I have hope every day because I get to work with over 170 organizations that are working globally and in the United States to build peace. And just to name a few, New Gen Peacebuilders is working in high schools to not only just teach about peace building, but actually doing projects in the school and the community. You know, IREPS is, you know, looking at mis and disinformation and build up, and the Bridging Divides Initiative. You guys published amazing guides for elected officials, and urban rural action, you know, looking at how do you bring communities together. I mean, I could just go on and on and on about the National Association for Community Mediation. And we did get Congress to start, you know, building up the funding again for the community mediation centers and community grants. Like, I mean, there's just so much amazing work out there, and that gives me hope.
I think very quickly to add to that, the thing that also gives me hope too is seeing like the more behind the scenes work that's going on, because through my work, you know, we track protests, demonstrations, that sort of thing, and kind of taking it back to the mobilization following, you know, the Lead the Dog decision. Obviously, you saw like a sharp increase in the amount of protests happening across the country, but then within a few weeks that like sharply went down, and like seeing that made me feel, it made me feel like frustrated, right? Seeing that there's, but like sometimes movements can't like sustain themselves, but that's just one part of political mobilization, right? Like protests aren't the only way in which we actualize change. There's so many like community organizations, mutual aid networks, people who are doing like the behind the scenes work that we're just not privy to half the time. So I think like knowing that people are like working every day to actualize a better world, and that's not necessarily materialized in the street all the time through the form of urban protest, but through more behind the scenes work also gives me hope.
Thank you. And I am a smart enough moderator to know to take this moment of optimism to bring this event to a close, because that was phenomenal. I think we went the full 360 on you know, on emotions in about 10 minutes there. So that's great. I hope we can carry over the good energy. There is some snacks and some drinks in the back that I hope you all will stick around to enjoy and chat with the panelists and each other. I want to thank our panelists. Eyako, thank you very much. Isabella, thank you very much. Liz, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to have you here. And thank you to Katerina, who did a lot of behind the scenes work to make this happen today. Thank you as always to Vera for creating this place and having us here. And I hope everybody enjoys this. This is the last time we're going to do this in this room. It's amazing. We won't be here next year at this time. So so you all have the distinction of having done this event in this room for the last time. It's been going on for a long time, but we're moving after this event. Don't worry, we're not going away. We're just I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. No, we're just moving and then here forward.
We will be here until 2024. And we're only going to 12.
Yeah, we're not going to. So, yeah,
You know, I didn't say anything, but I wrote lots of notes. But I just want to add one thing.
Sure.
Several things. One, I was surprised that there was a disconnect somehow between global and domestic, because in foreign policy, you know, in foreign policy it was always like this, and our historian, last historian, but there was never a disconnect. the issue of exceptionalism, I think it's going down, and I think that works well for all of us, right? Okay, it'll make all that good. I have tons of other reflections. I think the element from the student panel of surprise, what awaits you in another country. You know, I remember when I went to Ghana and I lay down in the bed and the whole thing collapsed. Okay, that was a collapse, right? But I was also in the Soviet Union in 1962. That was the thing, okay. And I left on October 18th, and I got to Moscow. I was in the Soviet Union for 2 months. I was working. I won't take for 1 or 2, yes. But the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred while we were there. And that reminded me of the Sri Lanka report that came out, right? And you only did a month, you said. I was there for 2 months. And so, but how you view, right, whether you're an outsider, at least I was an outsider in Siberia, right? But you all, I thought, brought some wonderful, wonderful reflections. I've been to these, I think, every time. But this was terrific. But there was an article, and I don't have you reading a lot. I think it was in Foreign Affairs, and I think it was in the beginning, and he talked about pessimists and optimists in terms of, to read it, in terms of countries. And what a different impact that has, okay? And I think we're all here, and especially those who are of different generations, but all of us, we're optimists, otherwise we wouldn't be, right? Okay, and by being optimists, I think we will bring change, okay? So I talked too much, but thank you all. It was a wonderful evening.
But be like Madeleine Albright. Be an optimist, but with a healthy dose of realism.
Thank you very much, everybody. Well, before everybody's. Katerina? Katerina?
The answer to you guys like